All right, we are good to go. So my name is Derrick Simpson. I'm a volunteer with Strong Towns Ottawa and the Centertown Community Association. And today we are hosting a virtual Ottawa Urbanism Book Club with Steven Higashide, the author of Better Buses, Better Cities. And we're just going to get straight into it. The first question I have, it's actually based on a quote from chapter 1. I'm just going to read it because I thought this was the number one most useful part of the book. It's on page 17 on what bus riders want. So you say that transit service that is useful to most people satisfies 7 basic criteria. 1, the service goes where people want to go. 2, the service runs frequently enough that you don't have to think about it. 3, the service is reasonably fast. 4, the service is reliable. 5, you can conveniently walk from that service to your final destination. 6, the service is comfortable and feels safe. And 7, the service is affordable. So, Stephen, acknowledging that we live in the real world and there are constraints, what would you say is the number one most important factor out of all of those?
Oh,
I know it's
number one.
difficult.
Well, it's I think it's hard to put into a strict hierarchy because like what the barrier might be is going to be different for different people. So I'll say that I think that 3 that are just really important from the planning perspective are like frequency, like that is kind of the thing that takes transit from being something that you just have to plan your life around, or maybe you're just lucky and the bus is showing up. Like I've had that situation where I remember I was actually on sort of like book tour in Houston, and I just happened to be really lucky, and like these buses that were coming by every half hour, they would just show up like right while I was feeling I wanted to make the spontaneous trip somewhere, and it was amazing. But I just kind of knew that if I lived there, like I wouldn't really be able to rely on that. And so frequency is the thing that frequency in some ways is what takes it to something that is just useful for the everyday for a lot of trips. And at the same time, if it just doesn't go where you need to go, then it's like you can't even start the conversation, right? And so, there's this whole chapter about like Jarrett Walker's classic ridership and coverage. It's a trade-off, but in a way, it's like both of those are important. You need that frequency in those core corridors, and I think you can make the argument that if what you really care about is ridership, you want to make it as useful for the highest number of people, then just really focus on those high frequency corridors. But we know there are trade-offs, and in those lower density places, you want to have that coverage. So in a way, it's like they're all important to some degree, but I think of just the frequency and coverage as being both a spectrum, but 2 really important things in and of themselves.
I'm really glad you brought up the discussion of frequency versus coverage. Ottawa is a gigantic city. It's amalgamated, so it's a bunch of suburbs put together with cities. And when we had our in-person discussion last week, I was very much pushing for more frequency, more ridership. So, stressing the downtown routes and making sure they're frequent and reliable. And what someone said was, well, that might not be entirely the best choice because where a lot of the coverage is where the votes at council to fund transit is. So if they see transit getting worse, they're going to fund us less. Do you have any thoughts or solutions on how to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great observation. I think what I would say is that is true to an extent, but there's a political dynamic that goes in the other direction, which is that as you concentrate service in corridors and build ridership, the system just becomes seen as successful in a way that gets people excited about it and willing to perhaps expand the funding pie. And so I don't know that there's a blanket rule, but I think that if you it's like you need service that's concentrated enough that you can point to some parts of the network and say, hey, transit is really working here. And that then it creates this dynamic where maybe people in other districts are like, well, we want what, Ward 2 has. Like, we want that bus rapid transit service. And you definitely have to balance that against the need to serve everyone, both for real equity reasons, but also the political reasons. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point where, currently we're in a spot where it doesn't really work well for anyone. And that definitely doesn't build champions. So the final question I have before I open it up to the floor is, what do you think the biggest issue, just in general, stopping cities from having better buses and better transit is?
hmm um, I think in a lot of ways it comes down to whether folks in leadership at the transit agency and in the political system actually care about buses specifically. Because I think as I got into transit advocacy in, I guess, about 2007, and I would see a lot of, business organizations typically calling for big rail projects. And that tended to be what a lot of political leaders focused on. And you need to have the political leadership actually understand that improving bus service, just to quote one of the transit agency folks in the book, that it's thousands of these small projects, something like a bus network redesign in a way is these thousands of changes to routes. Maybe you're building several hundred bus shelters. You're in Seattle, the Department of Transportation created this unit that did kind of dozens and dozens of these relatively small projects around signal timing and reconfiguring intersections. You build this continual system of improvement, and it's just really different from what a lot of political leaders are used to thinking about. They're used to thinking well, we're going to win a $2 billion grant for some new rail line, and that's going to revitalize the city. And improving buses often requires a lot less money, but this kind of sustained attention inside the agency. And I think without someone just really caring inside the government, I think you don't get that. And one of the real shames, and I think this is changing quite a bit, even over the last 10 years, is I feel like I used to run into a lot of folks who worked in public transit in the US who clearly didn't seem to use the system themselves. And so they just didn't have a kind of customer or rider mindset in the same way. And I think that's changed a lot, and it's really essential to fixing this problem.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree. There's so many problems you don't see or won't know about unless you're actually on the bus. And so we'll open it up to the floor. Simon?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for taking my question. I have a few points here. I'll start, I think, the big one that's been bugging me. So it's funny, the day we had our book club over here at this, it was the day of the Transit Commission. So after that, I ended up watching that. They had a whole bunch of interesting points about what's causing a lot of the delays. And they revealed that it's half of them was caused by road traffic. Then it was 25% maintenance, 25% driver availability or whatever it was. And they kind of reveal something key. So we talk about those frequent ridership routes and then those coverage, those slower coverage routes. The city basically revealed that whenever there's a bus cancellation due to whatever reason, it's traffic or whatever, the city will essentially take a bus off of a frequent route and use it to cover for another route. So the justification is that the bus comes every 30 minutes. We don't want someone waiting for an hour. So let's take a bus off of the 10-minute bus, the 6 and the 7. These are very common routes, but they would take a bus off of those routes to make the wait not awful or whatever. But as we were kind of thinking, the cascading effect that then has on that frequent route is that reduced trust of people standing there waiting for that 10-minute bus is now 20, now 30, and then it's full. I'm just curious, what are your kind of views on that? Because we're seeing, I think, the city take that stance more closer to city 2, focusing on coverage instead of the frequency. But yeah, just kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's such a great observation, and just kind of like it seems obviously you've really kind of dug into the actual operations of the system. Um, I mean, I'd be curious what like what alternatives they may have looked into in terms of things like having drivers on standby, or like what does the dispatch system look like in terms of do they have a system that's like advanced enough to give them more of a range of how they make those choices? And and I don't know that I can, get into too many specifics here, but when I wrote the book, um, it felt like there were a lot of advances happening in transit agencies' ability to kind of manage fleets in real time. It used to be the case that I mean, just going back to like I say like the 1960s or 1970s, you would have all these dispatchers just out on the street because if the problem happened with a bus, you would need to do all of this like manual work to get the bus behind it to turn around, or it was very, very labor intensive, and that is becoming, and it stayed that way until like surprisingly recently. um and so I just wonder, like, like how sophisticated is the like technological back end? Like, do they have the ability to kind of um manage this through software, and if not, like, is that an investment worth looking into?
That's a really interesting point. I think like my initial assumption, I was thinking like what would cause it? Is it like lack of buses on standby that are ready to go, or lack of drivers that can take those routes? It could also, I think your point too, like the however they manage like the operations side might just not have the capability to do that. So the default is probably the easiest of just picking a bus off and just rerouting it. But yeah, that's I think something maybe we can try to figure out and push to get an answer from OC Transpo.
Simon, if I can interject just for a second with a depressing point. Last year in the 2023 budget, I believe it might have been 2022, the city of Ottawa was really short on cash. And they had a bunch of extra buses sitting around for redundancy, and they sold those buses.
Ooh.
And now they don't have enough buses to back up the system properly. And part of that is the LRT line 2 being delayed, meaning they have more bus service filling in for that. So hopefully it'll be fixed in the spring, but for now, there's a big shortage of buses. All right, I didn't mean to hijack that. If you have any more questions, Simon, feel free.
I have other topics, but I want to wait to let other people maybe ask a question first if they want to go.
Yeah, Josh Lalonde has a question in the chat, I think. He says, based on how accurate the GPS estimates when you text for when the next bus is coming, I suspect they don't have the software for dispatching.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially. All right. Tree, you have a question? You might be. There we go.
Sorry, I thought you were going to do it. So I'm also with Strong Towns Ottawa. We've been trying to advocate to get bus lanes on a specific street in Ottawa. Do you have like a mental checklist of what a transit advocacy group should be doing and what shouldn't we be doing? Like, what's like a losing strategy? Like, if we say screw you to the business owners, like that's not going to win over anybody, right?
Yes. I certainly wouldn't say screw you to the business owners.
Yeah.
I think that one thing that I wrote about often a lot in the book is this kind of quick build model, and trying to test out a bus lane even in a temporary way. Cities have done a lot with like putting some cones in the road, running it for even just 4 to 6 weeks, and that is really helpful for a few reasons. One, from like a political perspective, you propose a bus lane, people get scared. Like the business owners, many business owners get freaked out that people can't park there anymore. People have all kinds of concerns. If you can just get the city to put in even this pilot lane quickly, people find that it's not really that bad. Or maybe there are some individual issues, but it turns out that they're pretty easy to address. And then from maybe an advocacy side, like if you're doing a pilot project, it's only going to be around for a couple of months or something. It kind of can focus your advocacy efforts, because then you can say, look, this bus lane is here. Let's talk to everyone on the bus and make sure they know this is a really important time to contact the council member. Or let's use this time to interview some of the business owners, and maybe we'll get some people on the record saying, oh, it's actually pretty good. So that's one kind of tactic that I think can be really helpful. And the way it has played out, that's kind of the opposite of that sometimes, is advocates in Washington, D.C., for example, several years ago, they put in a lot of effort to get the city to study bus lanes, but the bus lane project took so many years that everyone like a lot of folks on the advocacy side basically got burned out. It's like they're asking people from the community to go to these public meetings, then more public meetings and more, and it's like 4 years later the project's not there. So if you can get a concept in the ground, I think that's a really good way to go. And I'm happy to talk more about, like, I think I'll leave it there for now, but I love this topic of like advocacy. How do you think about like creative, fun ways to get people excited about transit?
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm going to keep that in mind. I think we should we'll talk about it on Discord, but we'll tone back our messaging a little bit. It doesn't need to be 24/7 bus lanes. Thank you.
Yeah, I love your idea of doing faster, quicker things. Ottawa has had a specific BRT basically in their to be funded queue since 2016, and they haven't done anything since then. So it'd be nice if they could just, put in some temporary lanes, test it out. But we'll go to Jill, Simon, and then Josh.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for putting on this event. So your book was written in 2019. I would wonder how the effects of the pandemic and remote work might adjust your views on the types of trips people might take, or the high frequency corridors as easy to identify. In our particular context, our biggest downtown workforce is the federal government. And there have been bitter fights, to be honest, on getting them to return to office. So I'm like, it's not entirely clear that, for example, like BRT to downtown would be maybe sustainable over the long term, I guess, to me, if there's this big push to stay remote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm remote myself. I think that in some ways the pandemic makes one of the big kind of themes of the book maybe more true, which was like I was really trying to urge transit planners to try to plan the kind of routes that are useful for many different kinds of trip, as opposed to just the commute. And that's become like far more important, I think, as a principle. And so I think what that might mean in terms of like what's useful in a system is, those high ridership corridors are still going to be routes that run through dense neighborhoods or that connect a lot of important destinations, but diverse destinations. It's like, maybe a route that connects a hospital and like a pretty diverse mixed use neighborhood and other major institutions is going to be the kind of route that looks really good in this kind of post-pandemic world. And if you have neighborhoods where before the pandemic things just kind of emptied out after the workday, they're probably still pretty empty. San Francisco is actually an interesting example where transit in the San Francisco Bay Area had been, in a lot of ways, very reliant on tech employers, a lot of downtown employers, and it's still one of the regions in the US where like overall ridership is significantly lower than before the pandemic. But when you look at individual bus lines, there are quite a few that are doing much better than they were before the pandemic, and that's because I think the municipal government there has tried to focus on improving those routes where there's just this nice mix of activity in use and mix throughout the day.
All right, thanks, Simon, and then Josh.
Yeah, sure. I had a quick question. So in the book, there was that section. I think the analogy was like the sandwich or whatever, where you need like the top part of the bun, the bottom part of the bun, which is like, I believe it represented what, like the politicians, like political level, at the advocacy groups, and then it was like the public officials or in the transit agency. I'm curious, what would you say would be the main improvements we could do? Like for like the situation we're basically in, I think like the top part of the bun in terms of the political side, like our mayor isn't necessarily really heavy on improving transit, so you can't really count on too much support from that side. Obviously, us advocates really want to improve this, but the public agency officials, like the OC Transpo, like the company itself, like what can we do to kind of encourage them to become stronger advocates? Like one of the things we see is maybe like some of like when they give presentations, like they'll give a lot of the things they say sound similar to what the mayor is saying. So we wonder like, are they just taking what the mayor says and just going for that? Or, and my questions are, it's kind of all over the place, but yeah, what can we do to kind of push the transportation and agency employees and the leadership there to kind of be on our side rather than kind of just like parroting the mayor's office?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think that a good way to start, and maybe a question I'd have for you is whether you have kind of friendly, close relationships with folks in the transit agency where they might be willing to give you information in ways, like that aren't behind the scenes information. Because I think that I think in a situation like this, if the mayor, and I don't know the structure, but if the mayor has like a lot of control over the transit agency and is kind of middling on the issue, senior leaders are going to be very reluctant to say stuff publicly that that could be seen as undercutting the mayor. This was always something that I found like really frustrating about transit in New York, is that like the MTA in New York, they're never ever going to say something that contradicts what the governor says. Maybe individual people on the board will speak out, but staff are not. But you know that maybe behind that public statement they might feel differently. And so I think a good place to start is by seeing if you can cultivate a relationship that's closely enough that eventually you are sort of coordinating in a way on political strategy. And then I think that there are, especially when it comes to buses, like things like, bus network redesign, or even there are a lot of bus projects that aren't going to be seen as, where you can kind of engage on more of a technical level, I guess, or that kind of fly under the political radar for a while. And I think at the same time, hopefully you can agitate to make transit an important enough political issue that folks are ultimately like running their council campaigns on transit, and so maybe the mayor eventually feels like they have to acknowledge it more or give some ground. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But.
I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have a quick follow-up point to that too as well. I think you're right. I think like the political council and mayor side, I think, have a lot of influence over like the way that I think the transit agency will react. I think, as you stated, like I think in our case, like it seems like the OC Transport does push for things like they're doing a network redesign. It's one of the, I think the book had an example, like it's the network redesign, but no change to the operation budget. They're just shifting around buses essentially. And I think the other improvements that they all do within the constraints that they're given. But one thing we haven't seen is them explicitly go out and say, we need more funding, we need more money. I think it was TransLink in Vancouver, I believe, like their CEO, like they publicly went out and said, yep, our funding is being cut or whatever, we're going to have to cut service unless we are able to do this, like very upfront with the public. And I wonder, why our agency is not out there saying, hey guys, we need money to fund, all of these things that we need. And kind of like seems to just treat, everything is fine, don't worry guys, we have this. Like, I think we would like to see them kind of be more transparent with us and tell us what they need versus kind of going along with what they have.
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. So I don't know what the power map looks like in Ottawa, like in terms of decision making authority. There definitely are some transit leaders who have been more willing to speak out, and I think it helps if they are seen as like not beholden to any particular political leader. So for example, the head of the current head of the metro system in Washington, DC, who big presence on Twitter. For some reason, his name's just escaping me at the moment. But like he's quite outspoken, and I think it helps that this is a big problem in some ways. But I think in terms of him being able to speak out, it helps that the DC Transit Agency is kind of jointly governed by like our Washington DC district and 2 other states. So he's not like the mayor's person who is like not going to go against the mayor. I think that contributes to it. But in terms of the bus network redesign example, it would be great if the transit agency could at least commit to studying what could be done with more funding, even if they don't feel comfortable quite saying like we really need this. But just sometimes the transit agency can do its analysis and research in a way where they speak about it really neutrally, but they really tee up advocates to be able to speak about it in a different way.
That last point is really interesting. I think in the committees right now, one of the councillors put together a motion essentially asking just the transit agency to explore the benefits of the U pass is like the university pass. It's like a joint, it's half funded by the universities, half funded by the city, I believe, and it's like all students basically have free transit. And I believe, like one of the councillors asked them to explore extending this to high school students. So maybe that actually might be our way in to kind of get them to look into this if we can get a councillor to get a motion through. Because it seems like on their own, they maybe don't want to do that, but it's, if a councillor can do that, maybe they can. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
All right, Josh.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, so in the book, or I think in the introduction or the first chapter, you talk about like how a lot of these transit systems, the board that is governing it, like those people don't even ride transit. And I'm pretty sure there's some councillors on our council that have never stepped on a bus and have no intention of doing that. But I don't think it still exists, but at one point in the less than 10 years ago, I don't know exactly when, but there was like some kind of like campaign to get councillors to sign up to like take the bus to work for, I think it was just a week or something. and not all counselors, signed up for this, but a few of them did, and there was usually some media coverage. So I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts about how effective this kind of thing is, in terms of getting attention, but also getting the counselors to realize, hey, this is actually, like, it kind of sucks to get to work using this system. Maybe we should make it better. Yeah, like, or is it maybe kind of a distraction? I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's like it's one tactic that can be part of a bigger campaign. And I'm trying to remember if the week without driving is an international thing, or if it's something. Week without driving happened, I think, a few months ago, and maybe it's the third or fourth year that it's happened. It's something that, at least as far as I'm aware, has really been incubated by disability rights advocates in the U.S. And so that's one kind of moment that could be kind of used. So I guess I'd say that, like, yeah, things like that are useful, and they're not that useful if they're a one-off thing. But I think I've been taught to think of a campaign as, it's like you're kind of like hiking this series of peaks, and like maybe one of those peaks can be this, like, week without driving, where it's kind of this moment, you're focusing a lot of attention, you get some media coverage, maybe there's a counselor who's really moved by the experience, then you can kind of work with that person for a few months to try to get something that you want. So I think it's a useful tactic.
What I would love to see is a day or a week where everyone who has a car and is able to drives everywhere. And then we can see what happens when there's gridlock everywhere and no one can find a parking spot. I'd be interested to see what happens. All right, we'll go to Simon.
Hi. Well, not specifically related to buses, but I think it's kind of close to that. We recently, our main BRT corridor was upgraded to a light rail train. The frequency was pretty good. It's like every 5 minutes. But one of the things they did a few months ago, I think now, is that they cut that frequency from every 12 minutes or every 6 minutes to go up to like every 12 minutes on the off-peak hours. There was a note there as well in the book. It was like 2/3 of transit trips are taken in off-peak hours. And I think one of the things that, by the way, this passed now, so it's been cut. And they mentioned they would like look at the numbers to see if they could make the case for frequent service in off-peak hours. I'm curious, what recommendations would you have for us to kind of make that argument that we need this service in off-peak hours? To kind of, like, one of the thoughts that we had, for example, is like an extra 4 minutes means someone might miss a bus connection on the other station, and that actually increases the overall journey time by 30 minutes if it was like a coverage route. But yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts.
Yeah. I do think that's a pretty good example, actually, and I think that especially, like, the more you can find, individual, like, people for whom that their actual, like, transit trip. I think those kind of, I think those personal stories are really effective. And I think I maybe would need to know, let's see. I think it is actually, just to kind of run with that example, I think trying to talk to your members or folks, like, just try to get as many stories as possible as to how it's affecting people, because there might be a lot of different things that come up. It's like, I don't know whether there are safety concerns on the system, but you know, when you have to, if you have to wait around for 12 minutes instead of 6, or like maybe a train's running late, now it's 15 minutes, the feel is really different to folks if you're in an unsafe, if you feel like you're in an unsafe environment. That might be one kind of thing that comes up. I think the bus connection is a very real one. You know, I think it's just good to, yeah, I would ask people and see what comes up, and there might be a lot of things that none of us have thought of.
I think my worry is that when they say they're looking at the numbers, like they're going to look to see the ridership data, presumably, and they're going to say, oh, well, it's unchanged, right? Like it's fine. Like the cuts were like, they were okay. But I wonder, yeah, I think your point there, I think getting the individual stories of misconnection, like really obvious examples, I think would help kind of break that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, thanks.
Josh?
Yeah, thanks. Another question I had is, so it does involve a little bit of, I guess, Canadian political context that is a bit different than the US context. So you might not have all this information about it, but I think one big difference between the US, as far as I understand, and Canada in terms of municipal politics is like what kinds of revenue sources are available. Like in Ottawa, specifically, almost like the main source of revenue is property taxes, and of course the transit fares for the transit system. And I know in some American cities they have a piece of the sales tax and some of the other like tax streams, I guess, that are not available here. And as a result of that, it means that a big part of the funding for especially the bigger transit projects comes from the provinces and the federal government. And so the city has like some constraints on like where they can get money from to actually fund transit, and so they're sort of dependent on the higher levels of government. But that I think has contributed to kind of a like the dynamic I think you mentioned in the book, where like there's funding for these big projects like our LRT system that came online, I guess 5-6 years ago now. So there was a lot of federal and provincial money for that, but there's no money for the operation once the thing is constructed. So the city gets a new system, but then has to spend a lot more to run it without any extra funding. So I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about like how to, so ideally you have cities that have the power to, get tax revenue from different sources in different ways, but like that's obviously a whole changing the constitution of the country question that is beyond the scope of the book. But like, how do you have any thoughts about how to sort of shift the politicians at the higher levels of government away from just funding the project that they can do a ribbon cutting in front of towards like sustainable funding for ongoing service?
Yeah. And this may feel like this is beyond the scope of what is possible for you to work on. But I imagine, right, there would have to be a change in provincial or even federal law to give localities more options. But that is something that you could consider working on. And I think, what would be an interesting question is, like, to what extent is it possible to build a coalition of groups throughout a province, for example, like outside of, like, does it feel relevant to, or can you think about how to make it feel relevant in smaller cities or even rural areas? And I'm not sure that I have a great example. It's something that, like in the US, I often feel like there is untapped potential to have more of a conversation about how public transportation is actually still quite important in rural areas. And could we build a political coalition in the US that marries urban and rural interests around transit. You know, in rural areas, probably public transit is never going to be the primary way that lots of people get around, and yet it, I think, is in some ways even more important as a kind of social lifeline service. And there are so many people in rural areas who are struggling to age in place, or who would benefit from even bus service running 4 or 5 times a day to get to urban centers, and that just doesn't exist in some places. And so I think it's really, you know, whether it's something that you all have the time to do or not, I think it's really maybe important to think about, can you frame it as something that matters to lots of people in the province?
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that. Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's definitely worth pursuing the you know, making the changes that would give cities more power to have, you know, different streams of revenue for either specifically for transit, but also for lots of other things. But I think that is a longer term project to get going. Whereas, like, what I'm thinking of is, I mean, if the federal government decided we're going to give the city of Ottawa $1 billion a year to fund transit or something, they could just do that immediately, right? But that's not the kind of decision. Like, they're much more willing to give $1 billion to build a new system that they can do their photo ops in front of, compared to give $1 billion to run the system for X years, which, you know, doesn't involve any media appearances. So I'm thinking more in, like, as a, I guess, short to medium term sort of strategic priority of, like, how do you convince or push politicians at higher levels of government that, like, this ongoing funding is at least as important, if not more important, than, you know, funding for big new projects.
I was trying to find a link, and I couldn't, but this actually does mirror a conversation that's happening in the U.S. right now, where the federal government in the U.S. does not provide operations support except in rural areas and small cities. And at both my, like, prior organization and my current one, we advocate for changing that, and have been advocating for federal legislation that would create a new kind of bucket of funding for operating transit. It's called the Stronger Communities Through Better Transit Act. I can try to find a link at some point. And just to say that, like, that's something that, like, there are dozens of groups that are working on in the US. It's also probably a long-term project. But maybe, and I'm not as up on this as maybe I should be, but I mean, there are some conversations happening nationally in Canada, yes, about, like, what the federal role in transit should be. And so maybe there are some ways to talk about why funding the services is as important as building.
Josh, one thing I'd like to add is I think we should celebrate more often operations funding from higher levels of government. I mean, what we see with the GO train in Ontario is every time the lines, every time they add more frequency, they make an announcement of it. And I would love to see if, you know, let's say we get $3 million to bring back LRT frequency. It'd be great if, you know, the federal government came, cut some ribbons, and made an event out of it, you know? All right, Simon?
First, actually, kind of to continue on that topic, like, I think you're right. They want to announce the sexy things, right? A brand new train opening, like, has a nice big photo shoot, whatever. But I think another thing we don't see them focus on is, like, BRTs. Like, it seems like at least the federal and provincial governments have no interest on, like, funding BRTs. That's the city. That's something we're funding completely ourselves through development charges and property taxes. But it is as effective as a train, and in some cases they can be better than have higher ridership than a train, especially since they're more integrated in busier areas than a rail project that might have to not be so integrated. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know. that'd be something to be try to make that more exciting maybe to them. But the other question I had was kind of related, and I was looking to see in the book if it talked about it. I might be wrong, I might have not discussed it, but the metrics we use to kind of assess the health of a bus system or of the transit network as a whole, like the KPIs, I guess, for that network, have you seen examples or in the US or maybe cases where that has been pushed for, reformed, or changed and made the transit agency a lot more transparent about like how the system is currently working, so advocates and other people can kind of look to that and see like, yeah, this part of the system is struggling, versus in our case, like we kind of, it's not very I think they're improving the transparency a bit, but there are some metrics too, like I think a late bus can go up to like 6 or 7 minutes before it's considered late, so it kind of makes it difficult to actually judge the health of the network. But yeah, I'd like to know any examples if you have any.
Yeah, I'll pick I'll pick kind of maybe 2 examples. One is, I'm sure you got from the book that I am a big fan of accessibility as a metric, access to destinations, and Seattle, various governments in Seattle have adopted metrics like, what percentage of residents can walk to frequent bus service, which I think is really helpful as just a measure, as kind of the best measure of like how potentially useful is the transit system to someone. And then in terms of transparency and getting kind of more detailed into the KPIs, there's a group, I can't remember if I don't think I talked about them in the book, but there's a group called Transit Matters in Boston that does a really good job of things like taking data from the transit agency and publishing these data dashboards that end up showing things like, a couple of years ago, there were all these slow zones in Boston's Red Line, and now you can actually see that it's improved quite a bit. And so the average running time is much closer to what it should be. And I don't know what the situation is in Ottawa, but certainly transit agencies often measure or use metrics in ways that aren't very helpful. Like sometimes even delay is only measured at the end of a line, so you only know how late the train or the bus is at the end of its line, which is really not useful. And I think it is, and I think that there are, I guess I would just say, I've definitely seen several examples of advocates successfully pushing agencies to improve their metrics, make the data more public, and then when the agencies have like published it as open data, often advocates can then take it and display it in ways that are pretty user friendly.
That's a good point. I think as you were saying that, actually, like that, like tools, or there's a service that can kind of like get that data for us to see it. So that I'll quickly link in chat if anyone's interested. But there's something called TransC. I think other people, I think it's just mostly used in Canada, but it uses that publicly available, that GTFS data or whatever it is, to kind of like let you examine all the routes and you can see the times they arrive and everything. I think the issue is that I don't have the technical expertise to like interpret this data in any way. Like it's a lot of complicated charts and stuff like that. I think your point too, like on how they measure a late bus, because if it arrives at the end destination, it's only 4 minutes late. But if it was off by 20 minutes for a segment of the trip, that it's not really telling the right data. So maybe I think that's something that us as transit advocates, we can try to kind of improve and like match that against the data that they're giving, and that'll kind of show us, I think. But yeah, that just a note for me, I think, to try to get good at this.
Yeah, or maybe have more folks join the club who have some of those skills.
Definitely. We have time for one more question. Does anyone who hasn't asked a question yet have anything they want to ask? Anyone? Duncan, I know you just joined. I have a feeling you would probably have a question, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
Not at the moment, no.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have then. The one thing I would say is if anyone hasn't read Better Buses, Better Cities yet, I would definitely recommend it. Perfect Books, the local Ottawa bookstore on Elgin, sold out before the book club, the in-person book club, but I believe they've restocked. So I highly recommend you read it. And Steven, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care, folks.
All right.
Thanks all.